everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Before we jump into it, I want to say that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted online. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the webinar, so please engage and interact. Today, we have two very important speakers who will be taking us through the reality of AI in banking. First, I would like to introduce Jay van Zyl, the founder of ecosystem.ai. Joining him is Matthew Hindley, the Chief Executive of X-idian, a consultancy specializing in AI and applications. Today, from the possible impact that AI can have on banking business value to the technical implementation and challenges, these two gentlemen are going to be giving a truly insightful discussion into what it means for banks to be using AI and looking to implement AI. Before I hand over to them, I'm going to pose a question to our two speakers and say, upon doing research, one of the biggest determinants of whether a bank is going to implement AI or not is where they can see the greatest impact or the highest potential for impact. So I want to ask if you can begin by exploring the opportunities in a bank where we can see the highest impact.
I can give a quick glimpse and then hand over to Matt, if that's all right. I'll give a product view and then Matt can give a consulting or a making it work view. The thing is that a bank, like any other organization, is trying to achieve certain outcomes using humans in the system. And if there's human intelligence and human intelligence is used repeatedly in the same way, AI essentially is a key target to either assist or replace people performing certain tasks. So the big debate at the moment is, if I had to think of the bank in the context of its customers, or the bank in the context of a risk-managed enterprise, or the way in which it wants to protect its money through fraud and other activities, all of those areas in the bank are opportunities to automate further, especially in the context of digital. We know that across the board, studies are showing that companies are experimenting, implementing, trying out concepts across the entire spectrum. I think where things get tough is when you're trying to do it all yourself, when you have to go and figure out every possible combination of technological components that at the end of the day will solve a particular problem. And because of that, and because of this unknown set of technologies and unknown set of approaches, we find that there's enormous inertia in the system. There's enormous amount of conversations and debates, and the options are vast. So if you had to look at the AI product landscape, let's just look at the top 1 million language models as they are published on Hugging Face or any one of these communities, or the top 20 that you maybe use yourself, or the top 10 that is actively being applied in a company. Which one should you use, under what condition, and how would you apply it? And then by the time you want models to produce accurate and precise outcomes, where do you use what's called classical machine learning, the explainability and those capabilities with your generative? How do you bring all of these elements together? So we're definitely just seeing that the opportunities lie in finding a very narrow part of the wedge in business where they know they can have the biggest impact, and then get going with some kind of solution that will solve that. So we definitely see that banks are experimenting options to figure out what that's going to be. At least from a product point of view, we can see that companies are asking these questions all the time.
And so I think on the back of the experimentation part, us from a integration and from a consulting point of view, a lot of clients, banks, insurers are doing a lot of experimentation, like you said, and there's pockets of it. One of our clients has got something like 200 AI POCs on the go, and we do know that AI proof of concepts are great because they de-risk certain things, but AI not in production is really very little value. And what we're starting to hint at and drive with certain clients is to experiment less and go after a handful of use cases. For the banking sector, hyper-personalization seems to be a really key one, because if you get hyper-personalization right, things like cross-sell, retention, and upsell follow quite nicely. But the longer you take with these things and the longer they stay in experimentation or proof of concept mode, the longer the opportunities missed. I'm sure we're going to get into some discussions around build versus buy. And I came from very much a build world. And I used to fly that flag really high around why you should build. And I think we're in a world where you don't have to choose, and you shouldn't.
If there are so many options available and you have a finite amount of resources and a finite amount of, especially financial resource and intellectual resource, where do you really spend your time? So we definitely see that even though anybody can, with a fair amount of ease, go on to their favorite language model that is supposedly going to give them all of the best ideas if they want to brainstorm. And we see these all the time. Clients will send through the top 50 ideas that they want to implement from an AI point of view. As you work through these lists, and I've received them all the time, I said to the client that you do know that the first 3 years each is going to keep you busy between 1 and 3 years if you want to do this yourself. And that is without the risk that you're going to take in technological adolescence through the journey. Because by the time you start, you know that there are companies that focus, that obsess over solving these highly specialized problems. So I think that there's an opportunity kind of matching exercise that often is missing in a lot of these organizations. So we kind of see it like Matt, I think on the one end, if you think of the business conversations you've had with clients before, everybody wants to have everything right now until they hear that, oh dear, this is going to cost me money, that's going to require resource, it's going to require people. It's almost like you need to have these two-dimensional perspectives that you need to take. One is, do you know what the business opportunity really is? Do you know by the time you've quantified it that there's a risk associated with it and something that you can achieve or not? And on the other end, do you have some kind of technological partner or an approach to deliver on that? And I think that bringing these dimensions together often, they get ignored in many cases, I find.
No, I completely agree. When we're working with banks, you've got sales guys like myself driving messages with business, and IT and business was the usual standard when we were building applications. Now, when we're looking at AI, which is very data-driven, you've got this massive data fraternity, making sure everyone's included in the conversation very early. These solutions being driven are solving business problems. Everyone part of the journey has their say to say, well, I'm a bit worried about this because of certain governance, or I'm a bit concerned that it's not in line with this roadmap. And very quickly, we can direct things into some sort of trade-off slide. So to say, okay, what is the most important thing at the moment is to take advantage of this addressable market. We want to get closer to our customers. We feel that our one product customers who've got a transactional account should have at least 3 products with us, because then we know we can retain them. And then we know that selling them new products will keep them with us and will increase our revenue. And then you can drive the entire conversation around that value, as opposed to everything else that gets muddied in the water when we start having these conversations.
But Matt, don't you also think that we often trying to describe that process as strategy by budget? Because what happens is that you run this cycle of planning and you have got all these aspirations that you've coded into your execution and operating model. And you've basically created, frozen in time, a view of what you think your business is going to look like in a year from now. Every month that goes by, somebody brings a new idea and a new way of solving the problem that is way beyond what you thought your initial plan was. And because of the fact that you are forced to stick to the plan, and unless you want some red or orange on your React status at your next board meeting, means that you end up implementing the wrong things perfectly. And I find that for me, that is probably the number one opportunity killer that I've seen personally in banks or any large organization at the moment. And that is, you need to have a way of approaching many of these things, and especially in the context of new technology, where the business, solution that you're after, or the problem that you're attempting to solve, or the impact that you're trying to create should be the focus. not all the components are needed to achieve that focus. And often the debates come into exactly like you're saying, my standard is X, my architecture is Y, my favorite cloud provider is this.
Yeah.
And the debates we're having with clients all sit with the same problem. They say, well, we've just been through the governance, we've just been 3 years approving this process. And they say, well, after 3 years of approving it, you do know that it's now 3 years out of date. You need to have a different approach to achieve the next cycle. The debates I've seen, even with the conversations I had with people in New York, sit with the same problem. It's almost a universal financial services problem that you need to remove those shackles of the different parts of how these problems get solved, because at the moment they're very much connected.
No, I absolutely agree.
If I can interrupt, gentlemen, from what you've been talking about here, Matt, where you mentioned AI can drive hyper-personalization, and we can see a lot of business value growing from the cross-selling and upselling opportunities there. And coming back to the point you made about building versus buying, I know that, and what Jay's just said, there's a number of solutions. How do you pick one? I know that banks employ highly skilled and intelligent men and women, and I know they also want to achieve business value very quickly or have an impact very quickly. So how do these banks now find the correct solution in terms of, do they buy, do they build? And I know you said you don't have to choose. So I'm asking, what's this process? What's the solution here for banks?
Yeah, so Matt 5 years ago would have come in with his build hat and said, if you want to maintain your competitive edge, you must build it. Otherwise, if it's bought, your competitor can buy it. But can you imagine trying to build an LLM? Trying to reinvent the wheel of so much that has been built that can be reused. I remember a previous company that I worked with, they were so married to their algorithm, the client we were working with, a massive hedge fund. They didn't care about anything else. They built a lot, they bought, but the one thing they would not part with or let anyone see was that algorithm. And when they pushed into production, the CIO would go into the room, it would be a closed-off situation, and he would push into production because he would be able to see the algorithm. With state secrets and big bank secrets like that, yes, I'm sure that build component and that algorithm can be built, but everything else around, you should be looking at buying it, especially if it accelerates into market opportunity.
So, Matt, don't you think that if you think of the core of what a bank is, and I always find this fascinating working in different parts of the world with any, like, let's say, retail financial institution or an investment fund or a hedge fund, or, embedded finance or any one of those organizations, is that when you look at it from the outside, they look exactly the same. In actual fact, they are forced by regulation to look the same, to behave the same. They are being checked by the same people under the same conditions all the time to be a kind of organization where they all look the same. When you're on the inside of the institution, the first thing that I was taught, and I think this is kind of a Canary Wharf, London, banking saying for challenger banks, it said, well, the number one strategy is just to get it to work. And I think that sometimes people forget the amount of effort, and I've been fortunate enough to be through a bunch of startups in my career where we started banks from zero and then got it to a point where they went live. The amount of pain, the moving parts, and all the steps that you have to get through to get it to work is so enormously complex that by the time it is running, to go and tweak it becomes a major nightmare, because you don't have the luxury to shut it down for a month, to close it, to stop doing certain things, to decide that you're going to do an upgrade and not give people access for a while. So you're basically changing the engine of the airplane while you're flying it and trying to upgrade it while keeping your business as usual, as safe as possible. That adds a level of complexity that in other industries people don't always appreciate. Let me give you a fascinating one. A very large software institution did an implementation for a bank, and they basically just got into banking when we started working with them maybe 17 or so years ago. They were busy with vehicle asset finance and running the process. We did some of the analytical work. So we did the forecasting and figuring the risk profile and a few other things from an algorithm point of view. The algorithm was outside of this product, but they required an upgrade after 3 months. They got a letter from the institution that mostly used to work in manufacturing and said, listen, don't you just want to shut it down? We'll make sure you live by month end again. Just close it up for 2-3 weeks and we'll run the upgrades for you and get everything ready. And the bank executive had a complete heart attack and sent back to say, I will give you between 2 and 4 on the middle of the month, 2 and 4 a.m. that you can do your entire upgrade, but nothing else can change. The mindset is sometimes what people don't always appreciate. There is a complexity that comes into this, especially with AI tools. If you take an AI tool, let's take something that's got to do with customer interactions, like the example you used earlier, and you want to communicate with customers in a better style of communication. So you want to use new language, new messaging, you can run it as an adjacency. So that means it doesn't affect the core of the bank's transaction switch, your risk profiling, your credit that gets given, your loans that are being issued, your ATM must be live, your branch that must work. You can run it as a parallel exercise. You can then augment the outcome back into the bank. Instead of a human doing it, you have an intelligence doing it that is non-human.
Yeah.
But if you want to bolt something into your core, let's say your core fraud detection for transactions, or you want to be able to accelerate your loan application process that it seems everybody at the moment are working on, you now need to rethink business as usual. And as soon as that happens, I think you get this fear and the risk management that goes with especially AI models that need to be transparent. Because if I'm going to say to you, Matt, you can't get this loan because of, and I can't explain to you because of, I sit with a very different risk. So that means that the class of solution, the class of how you implement it, creates that bridge between all the opportunities are visible and they're out there and people want to implement them. But as soon as you map it back onto your enterprise, you realize that you fundamentally have to separate the areas of impact. If you don't do that, you're going to keep on discussing it. We sometimes made jokes, and with a client some years ago, we figured out, and this is a metric that we started using, the amount of time that it takes us to implement the use case in a telco company is about the amount of time that takes us to get a meeting in a bank with the architecture team to discuss what we're going to discuss in the meeting. So that is kind of the benchmark. How do you get around that? You're going to decide to build this all yourself compared to using something that can give you at least something that's going to accelerate it. Because we've got clients who've got hundreds of cases in production. And for you to get the first few means that you might rely on anybody outside to do that for you. And that combination creates risk.
If you get it right and get it into production, it's the whole understanding of being able to evolve it continually while the airplane's in flight and while the models are doing what the models do. We're not talking about standard applications here. We're talking about things that are constantly learning, constantly moving. Why would you want to monitor that yourself all the time and have all those expertise to do that when you can rely on somebody else who's done it with organizations very similarly to yours, with the same sort of governance? All the banks look the same. They have the same governance, the same problems that we've done already. So otherwise, you're just going into the unknown with more unknowns.
Sorry, Matt.
Yes, coming back to talking about fixing the plane while still flying it, we have a question in the chat asking, how can banks or financial service institutions leverage AI to build trust and maintain consumer confidence in this rapidly evolving digital landscape? What are some of the practical strategies they can implement?
I can maybe start. So I think you need to separate your style of how you're going to implement this into a business decisioning process that will help you to pick the right business priorities. And on the other end, decide what technological capability can be implemented to solve whatever that problem is that you're attempting to solve. In the broader AI world, you'll hear us use the language accurate and precise versus linguistically useful. So if you're going to take something that is linguistically useful, but it doesn't focus on, or it cannot deal with the facts at hand or the problem you're solving, and you allow a client to interact with it, you're going to end up with a major risk and some challenges. So that means that picking the type of technological solution that you have access to and map it onto something where you understand what these differences are, firstly, seems to be one of the big things. If you get that right, you can then decide where in your business focus and digital landscape you will map the right solution. So an example is that if you had to take something that is hot at the moment, people want to automate customer interactions with, let's say, a generative-based chat. You cannot have, as a financial institution, a chat that does not have incredibly tight guardrails. And actually, in fact, it's probably impossible at the moment to get a generic chat approved by any regulator or your risk or internal compliance people. So the question then is, from a client or customer point of view, why would you want to have that done? You want to have it done because you want to ease a conversation that is linguistically enabled. So in your solution, you need to decide which parts are linguistically enabled and which parts need to be accurate and precise. So if Madison had to go onto an app and you ask the question, how many times have I spent money on food in the last year? All that the chat needs to do, the linguistically useful piece, needs to translate your conversation into intent. It needs to have very reliable intent detection. And in the intent guardrail, even if it even remotely doesn't understand what you're asking, needs to throw it back to you to say, please try and ask the question again. Rather than saying, oh, you want to know about transactions, but I'm going to give you somebody else's transactions, or I'm going to give it to you over the wrong period of time, or whatever it might be. So that means that when you give that linguistic input, and I translate it into an action, if you think of our eco-agentic framework or the agent-based model, and I wanted to go pick up your balance, and I want to go pick up how many times you spent on an actual transaction, and I want to be able to count those numbers of transactions and then determine what you have spent money on, most of that case that you're going to be working on has got nothing to do with language models. It's mostly got to do with APIs and data access and agent integration framework. We've seen that probably 90% plus of any AI case that we implement or we have implemented, it's got nothing to do with AI. To make it reliable, consistent, and accurate when it needs to be, and linguistically useful, means that you need to rethink that architecture incredibly carefully. And that's why in our world, we call it fact injection. And you use your classical RAG and other mechanisms. But the point is that you want to be able to guard it. You want to be able to read it. And in some cases, you want a conversation to be highly specific. Madison, let me give you one of two options. Go find how many times you've done this, or tell me what transaction you want to do next. Sometimes you just want to give that person a few options to remove the nuances of having some kind of generative interface that's going to cause an issue. And that means that your backends, the algorithms that you implement, still need to be reliable, and they need to be consistent, and they need to be explainable. Because as soon as you're going to go to, that means that I think trust in the financial services sector with customers is not just your brand trust, the fact that you're not going to lose my money, the fact that you're always up, the fact that there's a way that I can communicate with you, that I've got multi-channel access. Those are all hygiene factors. We see that the future is going to be when you can embed these newer inventions to service that person better based on something that historically used to take a lot of time. So I think that that's maybe one angle. Matt? Yeah.
I like how you put that, because we often talking about, the actual physical channel of a contact center, and talk about guardrails. Put guardrails up with people as well. We made them read scripts. They had to work with certain systems. They had to work off certain rules and regulations on certain customers because they were compartmentalized. But being able to combine the two and use the contact center channel as a piece of glass, whether it be an app or your web app or your mobile app, using the intelligence behind that person, it's giving it guardrails and also growing the intelligence both ways, allowing the contact center agent to understand a little bit more about the person they're dealing with by allowing the technology to give it prompts or insights in real time to say, we've picked up a tone of frustration. Maybe you need to slow down your conversation. Maybe you need to move your conversation to this. But layering that with the intelligence allows both the system and the person to give a much better service and drive a more trusted environment that when a customer calls in or deals with a system or a person, they're getting a much better service.
Yeah. This is, something that we, been using to trying to separate our own reasoning. On the one hand, let's think about something that must be highly accurate and precise. That means that you're going to go to a database with the right authority and a security clearance to fetch data that require a process to make sure this specifically accurate and ready to be used. So that means that if I want to know Matt's name and I want to know your date of birth and your credit rating, some of the data stored against your name, I need to retrieve that reliably and consistently based on AI that has access to that. On the opposite end, the linguistic piece, if I'm in the linguistic part and I want to say, well, please give me my balance, what it needs to do is it needs to do no thinking. The generative has no work to do but determine the intent based on the verb, the noun, the adjective. So it needs to know the verb, what work you're going to do, the noun, the target, and the adjective if you want to have it done quickly, if you're unhappy about something, if the text, the emotion, and the situation. But that means that it then needs to immediately go and figure out that the intent is to go fetch and return. That's it. If it now needs to go and project to say, well, am I liable? Well, let's take a different example. Can I get credit if I want to purchase a new vehicle right now? Can I get credit if I want to get a loan right now? Now you've got a slightly different process because now you need to kick off an exercise that might, under normal conditions, have many humans in the process to fill in data and collect data from the customer and then use it. In a real digital world, you should be able to fetch the customer's data, pick the key attributes that are most important to you, use your linguistic engine to pass them back to the user and say to them, are you sure that this is still who you are? Is your identity number the same? Are your gender still the same? Was your marital status the same? Is your income the same? If it's not, provide some feedback. I can give you an indicative answer based, and then you can automate the cycle. And that means that integration requires you then to think about your tech stack in at least 4 layers. So your tech stack needs to have an analytical piece and a base data piece that is to do with all the data governance and rules and regulations that are applied in making sure that if somebody wants to change your address or somebody wants to change your date of birth, there are certain data points that cannot be changed. You cannot change your date of birth. Once your identity has been verified, it can never be changed. If somebody tries to change it, it means somebody is stealing your identity. That means there's a trigger event at the base layer of classical reporting and analytic has to be in place, and I think most banks have got a pretty good handle on that. What sits on top of that gets interesting because now if you want to use that data and you want to use it offline to make a prediction about Matt's future spending or what you're going to do next, I can run a job every night that takes your last 2 years worth of spending, your money in, money out, your current situation, your entire risk profile, and then produce an output for you that you can then access. And it can write a score. In a bank, you always need a confidence level. The confidence level could be, 1.0 if it's a lookup, if I've had a human or somebody verify the fact that it happened. As soon as it's a forecast, it could never be 1 again. It's probably highly unlikely that the forecast value is going to be 0.99 or even 0.80. You will give it a score that when you retrieve that data, even using your AI to retrieve it, it needs to use the confidence score to interpret the result back to you. You cannot say to somebody, I guarantee you're going to get the loan. If I did it on a forecast of a 0.8 probability, I cannot guarantee that. I cannot even use that language with you. By the time you get to the predictive world, where you take offline models and score them in real time, you can still provide feedback. You still use your confidence level, but you can start getting immediate feedback. The highest level is this continuous, dynamically converging models that deal with the soft side of how the volatility in the system is buffered by getting models to adjust dynamically. The static part of it, you still run. You still need all the other capabilities to make it work. Your AI layering sits on top of this. You still need core bank to function. You still need core data to be there. You still need core analytics to be done for the rest of it to work. You need to bring the two together, basically. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. That's what we found is probably the most practical product approach from our side.
We have another question in the chat. We actually have 3. So I'm going to pose the first one with a bit of context. It seems that the issues are not entirely or necessarily about leveraging AI technology to solve the problem. So it is a variable in the decision. But it seems that there are business processes or a business style of implementation that is hindering the pace of solving the identified problem. What do you think that leaders need to do to help banks transform and innovate? That's the first question, which I'm going to pose to you guys to answer.
Matt, you can go.
What's the challenge?
There's a kind of a business style of implementation that's hindering the process or hindering the implementation of solving the problem, finding the right solution. So what do you think that leaders need to do to help banks transform or innovate? So the hand is from a different person. The person who's raised their hand didn't pose this question. So I'm going to ask that you answer Devon's question first, and then we'll get to the others.
Hey, how are you? I haven't seen you for a while.
From a business point of view, and correct me if I've got the angle right, is that I'll go back to my narrative around solving business problems. The important thing that we must always try and do is solve business problems. Don't get caught up in the process. A lot of the time we get to a point with not just banks, any large organization that's got a lot of governance, business wants to solve their problems and take advantage of opportunities now. The other parts of the organization, the data fraternity, would rather slow things down because we've got to deal with governance and fines and those sort of things. I think the best way to deal with it is together and to always center around that business driver and what business are trying to solve. We get into a lot of proof of concepting and analysis paralysis, where we spend a lot of time trying to solve these use cases. If you think about the technology, it doesn't lean itself into this sort of time-boxed concept of show me how it works and then great, it works. It needs time to mature, to show you how it really works, to avoid the forever proof of concepting. Rather take on a use case, take on some technology, do it together with honoring governance and process, but continue down a path where you can watch the machine learning or the AI delivering value and improving that value.
I think to extend it from our earlier conversation, if you had to think of a classical business school 2x2 model, and you think on your vertical axis, and let's make business the most important at the top. And, in business meaning that somebody that is, a non-technical or maybe a technically minded business person, but somebody that sits in a situation where they own a P&L, they own some outcomes, but they're not necessarily technologically, kind of skilled or educated, so they don't always know what goes on. And then you got on that same trajectory inside an organization, the technologists are professionals, and they've been through, in most cases, very long training cycles. They understand how enterprises work, and they've been, like you were saying earlier, fines or crashes or downtimes or viruses, or they've got scars and they've got pain, and they know the things that can go wrong. And you've got these two creating enormous tension in the organization to make any business case work. Now, what complicates it is the other dimension. Do I take something that has already been done, proven a couple of times, that can still bring some level of confidence that I can implement it from a technological point of view. So let's say that I can acquire or buy a product or a module or something that has already solved a problem for me. Or do I construct it with my own team entirely from the ground up myself? And somewhere in between those two, I think the reality often plays out, because for somebody to build basic tools from the ground up, it's a bit like you deciding you don't like Oracle, Microsoft SQL, Mongo, and you go build one yourself from the ground up. I mean, it's not practical, it's not viable. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. So it doesn't mean that you can, that you should. Once the problem has been solved and an organization or an entity starts focusing on solving that repeatedly, you get pushed onto the other part of the continuum. So that means that you probably want to buy it from somebody so that you can focus on something that makes you more competitive. So I just think that these two interlocking concepts is what drives business value if you understand it. So that means that if you know that if business wants to solve a problem quickly and they want to go build it entirely themselves because they want to compete better, you still have to make the decision if the time, the cost, the complexity, the right kind of team, the classical enterprise project problem, the fact that enterprise has built version 1 and then has to maintain that version becomes problematic because they are driven by new feature output rather than by core capability as a focus. So that means that the business value you derive means that you need to have an understanding of this landscape. If you acquire something focuses on integration and take what you bought architecturally, it helps you to make sense of what do you need to do next. If you design and build it all yourself, you can decide what the architecture is. We've been through some clients who said, our real-time architecture looks like this, and we've already agreed that's what it is. It's only on paper. And everybody that work with us have to comply with this. They say, well, you do know that it's not practical. And they say, well, for us, the PowerPoint has already left my email box, and that we have to stick with it. The business person doesn't care what the PowerPoint says. All they care about is, can I get the profit? Can I get the customer uplift? Can I get the customer engagement? I don't care if you have a template, if you have a rule, if you have some understanding. The problem is when the tech person then comes into play and say, but hang on, the last time you did this, it cost us a fortune to get away from it. So Mr. Business, that debate can last years with nothing being done.
We have 2 more questions.
To add to that, it also boils down to KPIs, right? We've been digitally transforming for how many years? And
never ending.
We never change our KPIs. Our individual KPIs stay the same. Our departmental KPIs stay the same. And they contrast each other and they conflict. And then when we try and do something drastic that changes something, you either have to break something else and somebody's KPIs. So we land up going for this middle ground and no one gets value from it.
A good point.
Okay, so I'm going to give you the second question now from Anil. They say, how do financial institutions balance the need for scalable AI infrastructure with cost constraints and existing technology investments?
I can tell you we have this conversation from a hardware debate with clients quite often. NVIDIA is a successful company now and is becoming more worried because the alternative tech inventions from a software point of view are putting the infrastructure upgrade budgets under pressure, saying you don't need this large infrastructure anymore. So if you're going to train a base model, and we've been through a couple of those, we've got clients who've got, and actually one client who's got a massive GPU cluster that we trained deep learning models on that might run for 40 days or so. They made a capital investment to have that infrastructure, but in their industry, it made a lot of sense. But if you are an institution who's not going to want to make an investment of, let's say, 50, $60 million to build a decent cluster for you to train big models, you're probably going to go to your local cloud provider. Your local cloud provider is probably going to make sure that the model gets trained in some foreign location, not in a geography where you think it's going to be trained. The GPUs are not readily available by many of the cloud providers. You might end up using like Grok or Lambda Labs, where you can spin up a cluster, move your data there, train your model, kill the cluster, and then deal with the inference in your own infrastructure. The debate around model training is very different than model inference. So model training means that you really have to decide if you're going to want to train base models or even fine-tune a model that is going to cost you an enormous amount of money, because it's going to run for many weeks. And if you do that in a cloud, I mean, we had a cloud instance with a client that cost, I think, about 12,000 US per day to train a model. And if you add that as a fine tune on top of your base cost, obviously a lot of these prices have come down. Like, I know that when my daughter trained her stable diffusion model for images, she only spent like $14. And it was a video that lasted maybe 6 minutes or so. But the point is that depending on the case you're working on, the amount of data that you have, and all. But the point is that the model training, base training, fine tuning, and so on, has got one class of way in which you need to look at it. The other part of it then is if you do inference and you solving a problem that needs to be explainable and needs to be something that a customer needs access to, then you don't typically need a deep learning model because you cannot explain it easily. You might be able to explain how the layers deal with activation functions, but normally you would have a model that is a Shapley value or some explanation to say that this is why the model scored your risk like this, or your fraud like this, or gave you a credit score of the following. And that means that it typically needs generic CPU-based, high-performing infrastructure. If you want to do inference, let's look at DeepSeek. I've been running DeepSeek on one of our clusters, and I've been testing the 32 billion parameter model. The 32 billion parameter model cannot load in a 24 gig GPU. That means as soon as you start hammering it, you still need base infrastructure to do the inference. So you need to decide as an organization, as a bank, do I then use model as a service? So that means I call a model that I control myself on my own cluster that I rent from a cloud provider that is way too expensive. That's why a lot of the new GPU cluster companies have emerged. And you run the model there and you retain your data in your enterprise. And if you're going to vectorize your data and you want to, let's say, use RAG to do certain actions, you let the model do the work in one place and you're trying to retain, but it still does not mean that you are allowed to move any PCI related data around those models. So that means anything that's got to do with your personal identification or anything of the sort might not even be allowed to leave your jurisdiction. You would have to make the investment in your own inference infrastructure and then design the AI approach to leverage as many of the components as possible relevant to what you have access to, rather than necessarily what the latest technological invention is.
We've got another question, which I think is a really
there's so much to talk about in that space, Madison. I'll tell you what, it can keep us busy for days.
This might turn into a 2-hour webinar. This is a really interesting question from a sales perspective, which Hayden asks, and there's a bit of context to it. One of the biggest challenges we have in banks is to justify the spend on these kinds of technologies and have a clear ROI. This generally goes to an investment committee for approval. Many of us banks have been burnt on big platform spend that come with big promises and fancy sales decks, but in reality, when it comes to implementation, they are difficult to implement and fail to deliver results. How do we know which is the right AI platform for our organizations?
Matt, you can start with this.
Yeah, sure. How's it, Hayden? I'm glad you joined us.
You were dying to answer this thing. You're ready for it.
And I have a fair amount of context for why you're asking that. It's quite tricky, right? I know quite a few organizations that have gone down a route that have decided to build certain applications for AI capability and using various mechanisms apart from CapEx and OpEx that experimented and failed. I think it's difficult to justify which is the right one and how to do it, because the quick answer is let's go into a proof of concept and go down a route of doing this. You still pay for a proof of concept. You still have to do a fair amount of work that gives you a certain amount of value, but doesn't give you exactly what you need. It's a tricky one because you're continually evaluating other technologies. There's something always new coming along, which makes things very confusing. I think the best way to go about it is, I hate to use the agile term because it's such a bandied around term, but when we go into even a full build with ecosystem, we do a machine learning canvas, and we try and look at the one or two use cases that we can solve, and then we solve it. The way that the platforms commercialize on an annual basis, it's not the old story where you have to buy this massive platform and spend tons of money on it. If you think about 12 months, 12 months could be a proof of concept. In that 12 months, you've got a very good chance to understand the value it's going to deliver. It gives it enough time to learn and understand and build the intelligence around it. At the end of it, you can also say, you know what, it's worth investing in. Let's continue renewing the license and grow the capability. If you go for this large scale, going after one cloud provider and using all their tools for everything, you lose out on the acceleration, you lose out on a lot of the concepts that some of the lesser known names have built and thought about for years to give you this adjacency that can really get you value. So when I say or not, is it allows you to then not make that massive investment and give you a way to evaluate fairly quickly whether to continue the investment or not. Jay, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think maybe just worth noting that the way we've been trying to solve that is that kind of exactly what you're saying. You want to make sure that the tech investment is something you can capitalize over a period of time, because you should be able to derive the value quite quickly. But I think that the decisioning to deal with kind of three pillars. One is something that is entirely adjacent to what you're doing now. Meaning, can I run a marketplace app from a cloud provider or spin up an infrastructure that's going to run a set of algorithms for me with certain capabilities for a period of time to test it? I can rent the infrastructure if I need to, but it is an adjacency that runs entirely in parallel to what I do, and I can decide where the integration points are. The second part is where things get complicated, when it gets integrated. So let's say you build something custom, or you use a cloud provider. Let's say you use Bedrock or one of the new AI, kind of AI deployment capabilities, where they basically just license those models from existing providers, but then integrate it with your stack. Your risk is still that you're going to spend money on tech skill. You need to integrate it to see if it's going to work or not. And the promises that are being made are based mostly on hypotheses, if it's custom, because you don't know if it's going to work. If you get an adjacency and it already works, you can have a far easier way to describe its value than in the third one, is when it's embedded, the fight between Salesforce and Microsoft in the public. As it's Salesforce is attacking the Copilot model, saying that all that Copilot has done is taken a watered down model that is cheap to deploy and then sell it to clients at $30 a user, and the value that people are deriving is dismal. In actual fact, Salesforce have been pushing these videos, and the CEO has been talking about this publicly. I've been following that fight quite closely, and it's fascinating. Absolutely upset Salesforce is with Microsoft claiming that they're going to integrate all of the AI tools in their stack while Salesforce themselves are doing it. It's a bit like what happened with Oracle's new stack, or everybody's new stacks in that level of the classical enterprise software. For them to stay alive means they have to embed all the AI tools in the capabilities. But now they have to get the financial return. I think the risk is far greater paying for 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 employees, $30 to $50 a month, whatever it might be, because that's how the models are playing out, than for you to get an adjacency that's going to be used to make it more practical. And that's what we see banks are grappling with. They really want to believe that the big providers have figured it all out. And I can tell you that they haven't. Last year, I spent a lot of time in San Francisco, and I can tell you now that it is probably a bigger mess in the larger organizations than in the startups who provide the specialist tools. The question is, for the bank, where does it leave you? You are stuck between these different worlds. To make it successful, it's still going to rely on an internal champion, a technically minded business person that can get it to a point where that initial business value is so focused that you can see that, yes, it's going to make an impact, because the side effects might be the value, not what you're actually initially targeting, like we've seen already with some of the cases we work on. I know we're running out of time. So
we've got one last question, which I'm hoping you can answer before time runs out. implement AI in a bank, considering customer data is very sensitive?
Well, it's a really good question because we get it all the time. I'm kind of making fun of it, but it's not fun at all. And let me tell you why we trying to make it, less painful by laughing at it sometimes. Because when you arrive at the bank, security desk, you are asked to write down your name, your address, your ID number. You sign in the book. Sometimes they even take your license. They scan it. Sometimes some of the data that gets collected gets treated with a lot of respect, and sometimes it doesn't. In the AI world, if you think about it, there is no point training a model on your purely personal identifiable information because it's accurate and precise and unique to you. Models get trained and perform well because it deals with the generics. The fact that I've got certain genders, I've got certain education groups, I've got certain narrative conversations that I've had with clients, I've got certain complaints that they've done. I don't really want to know your personal identification number, your name, your address, your blood type. I don't need to know any of that to train a reliable model, unless the model is for you as a person. So we separate it to say that if something is hyper-personalized for you as a person, and I need to get access to very specific personal information, then I need to apply the current rules that the security infrastructure and the governance people have already put in place. You cannot get away from it. As soon as I aggregate, you lose the value of the uniqueness of the individual. Means that you sit with a different class of how you're going to deal with that particular technology implementation, because now you need to aggregate and group and deal with archetypes and deal with categorization problems and so on, that does not have the individual identifiable information anymore. So that means we find that every project, probably 60% minimum of our challenges is because of access to data and the rules and everything that get applied, and making sure that part gets done before you get to a case, especially if it's structured. If it's unstructured, you've got a different kind of challenge. If you're on a phone call with the bank, you've given them your card number and personal details, you can't use that voice, even if you transcribe it into a model anymore. The question is, how do you reliably take a transcription and remove all PCI data from that particular transcription if you want to use it externally? If your case is one that is going to rely on customer conversations, you need to host that model inside your enterprise and deal with the cost of building the infrastructure to do that, because you're going to want to ring fence it. And that, by the way, is probably another few hours of conversation. We've seen that a couple of times now. It's quite a big challenge.
Matt, before we end, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I want to debunk something. Jay said you can't change your birth date. My wife changes her birth date every year. She's still 35 at the age of 42.
So that means that you actually need 3 dates. The date you use for applying for a loan if you're too young or too old, the date that you want the world to know about, and the actual date of birth of what sits on that receipt that was printed the day when you were cataloged in some computer system after birth.
Thanks, Madison. Thanks, Jay.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks.